Astrid Dalton always arrived at Riverside High School an hour before school started. On this October Monday, as usual, she parked her modest Volvo in the teacher's parking lot, pulled a stack of checked essays out of the trunk, and headed for the main entrance. The cool morning air colored her cheeks with a blush, and the breeze slightly mussed her neatly styled blonde hair. "Good morning, Mrs. Dalton." Joe the guard greeted her, unlocking the heavy door. Astrid nodded back with a soft smile, the same smile that had everyone around her at ease. Colleagues were already gathering in the teacher's lounge. "Astrid, dear, did you remember the after-school meeting?" Martha, the biology teacher, called out to her. "Of course I haven't. And the script for the Christmas play is already ready," replied Astrid, sorting through the papers on her desk. 15 years at Riverside had made her indispensable. She taught high school literature and English, ran the school's theater club, and chaired the guidance council. The students loved her lessons. Mrs. Dalton could turn any work into a fascinating journey, and complex rules of grammar explained so that they seemed simple and logical. That evening, Astrid returned to her and Fletcher's home in an upscale neighborhood, large, but not overly luxurious. Her husband's black Lexus was parked out front. Fletcher Dalton was one of the most successful brokers in the city, and his name often appeared in the business press. Tall, trim, with barely noticeable gray on his temples, he radiated confidence and strength. "Honey, I'm home." Astrid set her bag on the hallway table. Her husband's muffled voice came from the study, another important call. She walked to the kitchen and pulled a chicken out of the refrigerator for dinner. Cooking always calmed her down, helped her get her thoughts in order. "Sorry, honey, urgent client." Fletcher appeared in the kitchen a half hour later, pecked his wife on the cheek. He smelled of expensive perfume. "How was your day?" "The usual. Took The Great Gatsby apart with the graduating class today." Astrid stirred the sauce. "And you?" "Great day at the stock market. Morgan Stanley signed a contract." He poured himself a whiskey. "There's an important reception on Friday, you remember, right?" Astrid remembered. Such evenings were part of their lives. Cocktails, small talk, soft laughter. She always looked impeccable. An elegant dress, a string of pearls, shoes with sensible heels. The perfect wife of a successful man. At dinner, Fletcher talked about new deals, plans to expand his client base. Astrid listened, nodded, asked the right questions. But something had subtly changed in their relationship over the past month. Maybe it was her husband's increasing late returns, or the way he sometimes averted his eyes when answering her questions, or the unfamiliar scent she'd picked up on his shirt a week ago. "Bea's doing a great job, by the way," Fletcher remarked, as if by the way. "New secretary," he explained, noticing his wife's questioning look. "Very efficient." Astrid remained silent, gathering her plates. 15 years of marriage had taught her a lot of things, like the fact that some questions were better left unasked, at least not until you were ready to hear the answers. As she fell asleep in their large bedroom, she thought about tomorrow's classes, the upcoming test, the script for the Christmas play. Fletcher had been asleep beside her for a long time, snoring lightly. Everything was the same as always, almost like always. A small crack had appeared in their lives, so imperceptible that it could have been forgotten. But Astrid was too good a literature teacher not to know that such cracks were where the real drama often began. It all started that evening, when the parent-teacher conference dragged on longer than usual. Astrid decided to stop by her husband's office. He often called her for dinner in town after these late meetings. Besides, she'd forgotten her cell phone at home and couldn't warn him about the change of plans. There was no one in the reception area. The door to Fletcher's office was ajar, and muffled voices came from there. Astrid froze when she heard a woman's laughter. "Fletch, stop! We might be seen!" A playful whisper, the rustle of clothing. Astrid stepped back silently, mechanically noting details: lipstick on the water glass, shoes of an unfamiliar brand under the secretary's desk, an undone button on the shirt of the husband she'd glimpsed through the crack in the door. She drove home on autopilot, parked, went up to the bedroom, took a shower. When Fletcher returned, she was already in bed with a book. "Sorry, got held up at work. Important papers." He kissed her forehead. He smelled like someone else's perfume. The next 2 weeks turned into a thorough investigation. Astrid checked dry cleaning receipts, reviewed call lists, analyzed her husband's work schedule. Beatrice Cromwell, 28 years old, has been working as Fletcher's personal assistant for the past 4 months. College graduate, single, lives in a downtown apartment, the same one Fletcher supposedly bought as an investment. Astrid has watched them from afar, lunches together, touches of hands as they hand over documents, long stares. One day she followed her husband's car to a restaurant on the outskirts of town. She parked across the street and watched him and Bea dine by candlelight. Fletcher laughed sincerely, openly as he once had with her. The revenge plan began to take shape gradually. Astrid envisioned different scenarios: public exposure, a scandalous divorce, revenge through her husband's career, but all of them seemed insufficient. The denouement came unexpectedly. One morning, their house was filled with men in suits with FBI badges. A search, an arrest warrant, the words fraud, insider trading, money laundering. Fletcher was led away in handcuffs. The investigation uncovered a scheme to commit millions of dollars in financial fraud. Bea disappeared. As it turned out later, flew to Europe the day before the arrest. All of Fletcher's accounts were frozen. At the trial, he looked aged and confused. Astrid sat in the front row, impeccably dressed, with a straight back. She watched his life crumble and felt strangely calm. 15 years imprisonment, the judge announced. Fletcher turned to his wife with pleading in his eyes. She answered with a level gaze. "I'll be waiting for you," Astrid said, as she was allowed a brief visit before being escorted away. He burst into tears, apologizing, swearing his love. She stroked his head and thought about how 15 years was enough time to plan the perfect murder. "Time, Mrs. Dalton," the guard coughed tactfully. She stood up, adjusting her skirt. "I'll write to you," she promised her husband. "And when you get out, we'll start all over again." That evening, Astrid sat for a long time in their empty house. On the table was a photograph from their wedding, young, happy, in love. She ran her finger over her husband's face in the picture. 15 years, she whispered. "A lot can change in 15 years, but not my decision, honey. Not my decision." The next day, she went back to work. She taught lessons, checked notebooks, rehearsed with the school theater. No one noticed that Mrs. Dalton's usual soft smile now hid a cold determination behind the usual soft smile. Time was on her side, and she had learned patience from years of teaching. The first year without Fletcher was a blur. Astrid sold their big house, it was too expensive to maintain, and bought a small cottage near the school. All of her husband's belongings she had carefully boxed up and put into storage. "Poor thing, she loves him so much," colleagues whispered as they watched her methodically sort through his ties and cufflinks. At school, she took extra hours and electives. "Mrs. Dalton, you're going to get yourself in trouble," Principal Hendricks worried. But Astrid just shook her head and smiled. Work helps you not to think. Her lessons became even more interesting. She put her whole self into them, as if she were trying to fill a void inside. Every Sunday, she sat down at her antique secretary and wrote letters to her husband. The handwriting was perfectly even, the ink dark blue, the paper cream-colored. "Dear Fletcher, I miss you every day." She described her life, her school days, the weather outside her window. Not a word of reproach, not a hint of the pain of betrayal, just love and loyalty. In prison, her visits were expected. "Mrs. Dalton is an angel," the guard said. She came every month, always impeccably dressed, with light makeup and a kind smile. She brought books that she carefully selected at the bookstore. "I reread your letters every night," Fletcher confided on dates, his eyes glistening with tears. In her 3rd year of incarceration, she was promoted to chair of the English Language and Literature Department. "You've earned it, Astrid," the principal said. Her methodological developments were published in professional journals. She was invited to speak at conferences. At home, in the evenings, she worked on her plan. In her office, in a secret drawer of her secretary, she kept a notebook of notes. She studied crime reports, read detectives, wrote out interesting details. The security system at the prison had taught her patience and attention to detail. "How are you doing, dear?" friends and coworkers asked. Astrid learned to answer in a way that made her words sound sincere. "I live in hope for his return. You know, true love forgives everything." She attended church every Sunday, joined a support group for prisoners' wives. "You're so strong," other women told her. Astrid comforted them, sharing advice on how to maintain long-distance relationships. No one noticed how attentively she listened to the stories of her released husbands, memorizing every detail of their adjustment to freedom. Years went by. She got herself a cat, Ginger, affectionate. She named him Fitzgerald. In the mornings, they drank coffee together on the veranda, watching the sunrise. "You know, Fitz," she told the cat, "patience is an art, and I'm becoming a real artist." In the 10th year of Fletcher's incarceration, she began to prepare more actively, made a list of things he would need upon his release, revamped her closet, more austere, more elegant. "How do you manage to look so good?" colleagues asked. "I want my husband to be proud of me when he comes back," she answered with slight embarrassment. Each day brought her closer to her goal. She continued to write letters, go on dates, maintain the image of a loving wife. Outwardly, she was still the same soft, understanding Mrs. Dalton. Only sometimes, late at night, sitting in her study over her notes, she allowed herself a smile, cold and determined. 15 years was a long time, long enough for pain to turn to ice, enough to learn to wait, enough to plan everything down to the smallest detail. And now, with Fletcher's release just months away, Astrid was ready to begin the final act of their story. Federal State Prison had turned successful broker Fletcher Dalton into a shadow of his former self. His first letter to Astrid was written with a trembling hand on ruled paper from the prison store. "Beloved, I don't know where to begin. Every morning I wake up and for a few seconds I believe it's all just a nightmare." He lost 20 pounds in the first year. Expensive suits were replaced by prison robes, business meetings by endless hours in the library and gym. He tried to stay out of trouble, followed all the rules, enrolled in financial accounting classes. "I think about us a lot," he wrote in letters to Astrid, "about how recklessly I risked everything we had. Money clouded my judgment. I let greed and vanity ruin our lives." The entries in his prison diary were different. "Can't stop thinking about B. Her last look in the office. Did she know everything was falling apart? Did someone warn her? And how can I look into the eyes of Astrid who has no idea? Her letters, full of love and support, are unbearable to read." By the 3rd year of his imprisonment, his letters to his wife became deeper, more philosophical. He read everything Astrid sent him, from classical literature to modern psychology. In the prison library, he was often seen leaning over books, making notes in a shabby notebook. "You know, honey, it's a lot of thinking time in here. Sometimes I lie awake and remember every moment of our lives, how you used to fix my tie in the morning, the way your hair smelled after a shower, how we dreamed of the future." On dates, he stared avidly at her face, as if trying to memorize every feature. His once confident movements became tentative, his gaze guilty. "You're so beautiful," he said. "I don't know what I've done to deserve such devotion." By mid-sentence, Fletcher had become one of the most respected inmates. He helped others with legal documents, led a financial literacy group, and organized a chess club. "I want to be useful," he explained to Astrid. "Maybe this way I can redeem myself a little." His dreams for the future were modest. "I'll get a simple job, maybe teach economics at school. The main thing is to be with you, to start over. I'm no longer the ambitious fool I used to be." A year before his release, his letters were filled with anxiety. "I'm afraid I won't be able to adapt. The world has changed so much over the years. Sometimes I think, maybe it would be better for you if you forgot me. Find someone worthy." But Astrid invariably replied, "I'll wait as long as it takes. We'll manage together." In his last letter before his release, he wrote, "I am not the same man you saw off to prison 15 years ago. I hope you can love the person I've become, because this new me lives only with thoughts of you and dreams of redemption." He didn't know that Astrid was rereading his letters with special attention, noting every sign of change in his character, every detail of his new habits and fears. This information was an important part of her plan. It was a cold October morning. Astrid parked her car at the prison gate an hour before the scheduled time. She checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, adjusted the collar of her beige coat. In the back seat was a suit for Fletcher, a classic gray suit with a white shirt. The formalities took almost 2 hours. Finally, the massive gate opened and she saw him, gray-haired, gaunt, wearing a simple jacket and jeans. Fletcher was squinting against the bright sun, clutching a cardboard box of personal belongings tightly to his chest. "Astrid." His voice trembled. She stepped toward him, let herself be hugged. He smelled of government soap and cheap laundry detergent. "Let's go home," she said softly, taking the box from him. "I made your favorite steak." All the way home, he stared out the window, commenting on the changes in the city. New buildings, disappearing signs, altered routes. His hands, resting in his lap, trembled slightly. The house greeted them with the smell of fresh baking. "I bought this cottage almost immediately," Astrid explained, walking him through the rooms. "It's a quiet neighborhood, good neighbors. Your office is upstairs. Everything is so cozy." Fletcher touched things gingerly, as if afraid to disturb anything. "You've created a real home." That evening, after dinner, they sat in the living room. Fletcher talked about his plans, getting a job, perhaps teaching. Astrid listened, nodding, pouring wine into his glass. Fitzgerald, her ginger cat, watched her guest warily from the windowsill. "I don't know how to thank you," Fletcher said suddenly, "for waiting, for forgiving my mistakes. It's all in the past," Astrid smiled. "The important thing now is to help you settle in." The next few days were filled with household chores. Fletcher was learning how to use the new phone, getting used to modern technology. Every morning they had breakfast together on the veranda. He tried to help around the house, but often got lost in simple situations. In the evenings, they discussed the books they had read over the years. Fletcher had become more well-read, his judgment deeper. Sometimes he would stop talking, looking at his wife with a strange expression, as if he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Astrid was always calm and attentive. She helped him with his paperwork, made doctor's appointments, made him a shopping list. "You have no idea how much I missed your care," he said. On the 10th day of freedom, Fletcher tried to kiss her, for the first time since his return. Astrid gently pulled away. "We need time, honey. Let's take it slow." On nights she lay sleepless in her bedroom, listening to her husband's footsteps in the next room. He too suffered from insomnia and often went into the kitchen for a drink of water. Sometimes she heard him crying quietly. No one at school knew about her husband's return. She had taken a month's vacation for family reasons. Only in her office, in a secret drawer of the secretary, lay a notebook with the last notes. There was not much time left until the finals. 2 months later, Astrid decided to have a special evening. Fletcher gradually settled into his new life. He found a job as a consultant for a small firm, started driving, even joined the local chess club. "We should celebrate your successes," she said over breakfast. "I'll cook your favorite dishes. Remember how we used to have romantic dinners?" She'd thought of every detail. She bought a new ivory tablecloth, candles and silver candlesticks, a bottle of expensive wine. All day long she cooked, specialty onion soup, steaks with rosemary, chocolate mousse for dessert. By 7 o'clock the table was set, logs crackling in the fireplace, jazz pouring out of the old record player, the same Ella Fitzgerald record that had played on their first date. "This is incredible." Fletcher stopped in the dining room doorway. He was wearing the same gray suit he'd walked out of prison in. "You remember all my favorite dishes." They dined leisurely, reminiscing about the past. Fletcher talked about his plans to teach finance at the community college. "I want to use my experience to warn others against making similar mistakes," he said, looking into his glass. "I'm so proud of you." Astrid covered his hand with hers. "Shall we drink to a new life?" She poured the rest of the wine into the glasses. Her hands were perfectly still. "You know," Fletcher began after a long pause, "there's something I have to tell you. It's been plaguing me all these years." "Shh," she brought a finger to his lips. "Let's just sit in silence." After 20 minutes, his pupils dilated. His speech became slurred. "Something doesn't feel right." "It'll pass," Astrid replied calmly, watching him try to get up from the table. "It'll be over soon." Fletcher collapsed to the floor, gulping for air. His gaze flickered to his wife, the horror of understanding read in it. 15 years, honey. She knelt beside him. I've waited 15 years for this moment. I knew about B, by the way. Knew about everything. His eyes widened even more, and he tried to say something, but couldn't. Astrid sat beside him until his breathing stopped. Then she carefully wiped the glasses, adjusted the tablecloth, and extinguished the candles. She went up to her bedroom, changed into her house clothes. At 23:17, she dialed 9111. "Help!" Her voice trembled. "I think my husband is having a heart attack. We were having dinner, and all of a sudden he felt sick." 7 minutes later, the police arrived, followed by an ambulance. Astrid sobbed in the arms of a young female officer as the paramedics pronounced him dead. "Poor thing," whispered the neighbors crowded outside the house. "Just reunited after so many years apart." Detectives Thorne Ramirez and Reed Maverick arrived on the scene at the beginning of the first morning. By then, Fletcher Dalton's body had already been taken to the morgue, and forensics were finishing up their examination of the dining room. "Mrs. Dalton, I'm Detective Ramirez." A tall Hispanic man in his 40s took a seat next to Astrid on the couch. "I know this is difficult for you, but we need to ask you some questions." Astrid nodded, blotting her eyes with a handkerchief. She was wearing a navy blue robe over a homemade dress, her hair slightly mussed. "Tell me, how was your evening?" "I wanted to have a celebratory dinner." Her voice sounded hoarse. "Fletcher recently found a job, started a new life, cooked his favorite dishes, onion soup, steaks, opened a bottle of red wine." "What time did you sit down to dinner?" "About 7. We talked, reminiscing about the past. Fletcher talked about his plans to teach, and then..." She held back a sob. "He suddenly grabbed his chest, tried to get up." At this point, Detective Maverick was looking around the kitchen. Young, trim, with a military bearing, he methodically checked the contents of the cabinets and the trash can. "Mrs. Dalton has been cooking all day," an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Parker, reported. "I saw her go to the store several times. Such a devoted wife, waited for him for 15 years while he was in prison." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "In prison?" "Financial fraud," Astrid explained. "But he redeemed himself, changed, started a new life." By 3 in the morning, the detectives had finished their initial interview. Forensics took leftover food and wine for examination, photographed every corner of the house. "Looks like a natural death," Maverick remarked as he and Ramirez got into the car. "The man spent 15 years in prison, the stress of rehabilitation, age." "Don't jump to conclusions," Ramirez tapped his fingers on the steering wheel thoughtfully. "We'll wait for the toxicology." The next few days were filled with routine work. Detectives canvassed all the neighbors. No one had heard any suspicious sounds or seen any intruders. Fletcher's colleagues from the consulting firm characterized him positively. Quiet, polite, very diligent. At the school where Astrid worked, everyone was shocked by the news. "She's been waiting for him for so many years." Principal Hendricks shook her head. "They had just started living together." Ramirez studied the history of the Dalton family particularly closely. Astrid's perfect devotion, regular letters to the prison, monthly visits, her husband's absolute forgiveness, had alarmed him. "Too perfect," he shared with his partner. "A woman waits 15 years for her criminal husband, creates the perfect home, throws the perfect dinner." "You're always looking for a catch," Maverick grinned. "Maybe she just loves him?" "Let's see what the toxicology shows." Ramirez pulled old photos of the Daltons out of a folder. One showed Astrid and Fletcher standing outside the courthouse the day of their sentencing. He gazed into the face of the woman in the photograph. Something in her gaze struck him as odd. A week later, the first forensic results came back. Ramirez studied the report for a long time, then silently handed it to his partner. "Oh shit," Maverick muttered. "Looks like you were right." Fletcher Dalton's system showed traces of a rare plant-based poison, slow-acting, almost imperceptible to the taste, causing symptoms similar to a heart attack. "We need to dig deeper." Ramirez pulled out the photos again. 15 years is a long time to plan the perfect murder. A misty Seattle morning greeted the detectives with a drizzle. Ramirez and Maverick sat in the archives of the district attorney's office, poring over yellowed folders from 15 years ago. The Fletcher-Dalton case occupied several boxes. A standard SEC investigation had suddenly uncovered massive fraud. Look, Ramirez pulled a photograph from the personnel file. It showed a young Fletcher standing at the entrance to his office, tall, confident, wearing an expensive suit. Next to him was a beautiful woman of about 35. Beatrice Cromwell, his secretary, disappeared just after his arrest. The search for Beatrice took almost a week. The trail led them to a fashionable Seattle neighborhood where a modern mansion with panoramic windows stood on a hill. Beatrice Cromwell, now Mrs. Beatrice Wells, lived here under her second husband's surname. She met them in the spacious drawing room. The years had done her good. A strict suit from a famous designer, perfect styling, the confident movements of a woman accustomed to luxury. Only the fine wrinkles around her eyes gave away her age. The large windows looked out onto the bay, where the silhouettes of ships could be seen in the misty haze. Beatrice sat in a leather armchair and lit a thin cigarette. Her red fingernails glistened in the dim light. Fletcher and I loved each other. The smoke from her cigarette rose in a thin stream toward the ceiling. It wasn't an affair or a fling. We were planning a future, she told, and the detectives listened intently to the story of the passionate affair, the secret meetings, the dreams of a life together. About how Fletcher was going to leave his wife, about the tickets booked to Europe, about the apartment bought for their meetings. And his wife, did she know? Astrid? Beatrice shook off the ashes thoughtfully. Not likely. She was too. Correct. A literature teacher, an intelligent lady, all about her books and her students. The rain intensified, drumming against the huge windows. The logs crackled in the fireplace, giving the illusion of coziness. 2 days later, the detectives met with Astrid again. She received them in the school library after school, a spacious room with high shelves and the smell of old books. Yes, I knew about Beatrice, she said quietly, going through a stack of notebooks. Things like that are hard to miss. But 15 years is a very long time. You rethink a lot of things in that time. Learn to forgive. She looked up at the detectives with a clear gaze. I teach literature. Every day I tell my students about Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Shakespeare, about how destructive revenge can be, how important it is to be able to forgive. It would be strange to teach that to others and live differently yourself, wouldn't it? Her words sounded convincing. Perhaps too convincing, Ramirez thought. That evening, the detectives sat in a half-empty bar near the station. It was still raining outside the window. Let's go over her finances. Ramirez twirled a glass of soda in his hands. All spending over the last year, contacts, travel. Especially interested in any connections to botanists, herbalists, rare plant specialists. You think she's lying? Maverick sipped his coffee. I don't, but something's not right here. 15 years is a very long time to forgive, and even longer for planning revenge. The breakthrough in the investigation came during the re-inspection of the Daltons' home. Maverick was methodically checking the contents of the garbage cans when he came across a scrap of a receipt from a chemistry and biology specialty store. That's odd, he muttered. Why would a literature teacher need lab equipment? That same evening, they had requested data on Astrid's purchases from that store. Over the past 3 months, she had purchased a precision scale, a set of test tubes, and several chemical reagents. Ramirez immersed himself in studying her computer. The browser history appeared to have been thoroughly cleaned up, but there were still traces of search queries in the cache. Poisonous plants in the works of Shakespeare, herbs in medieval literature, methods of alkaloid extraction. Look, he beckoned to his partner. She's been disguising her search for information on poisons as class preparation. Here's a class presentation on the use of herbs in Romeo and Juliet, and here are bookmarks to scientific articles on plant toxins. After obtaining a second search warrant, they thoroughly searched every corner of the house. In the basement, behind a rack of pickles, they found a small door. Behind it was a small room set up as a laboratory, a microscope, scales, flasks, herbs in glass jars. On the wall were neatly hung clippings from scientific journals about rare poisons. Under one of the floorboards in the study, they found a cache with an old safe. Inside was a leather-bound diary and a flash drive. The diary began with an entry from 15 years ago. Today I learned about them. Fletcher and his precious bee. How long they laughed at the stupid, naive teacher. Page after page unfolded a plan of revenge, methodical, detailed, meticulous. Astrid took botany courses, studied poisons, consulted with experts under the guise of scientific work. The flash drive contained photos, Fletcher and Beatrice, secret meetings, kisses, vacations together, and a separate folder, the results of experiments with different herbs, records of symptoms, dosage calculations. 15 years, Maverick shook his head. She's been preparing for 15 years. And created the perfect cover, Ramirez nodded. A loyal wife waiting for her husband from prison. Who would have suspected? In the last diary entry, made a week before the murder, Astrid wrote, "All set. He came back a different man, repentant, soft, grateful. Thinks I didn't know about his infidelity, that I forgave his financial sins. That gratitude in his eyes. It makes revenge all the sweeter." By nightfall, they had reconstructed the whole picture. 15 years of impeccable behavior had been a mask. Every letter to the prison, every visit was part of the plan. She was creating the image of the forgiving wife while she methodically prepared for the murder. At 10 p.m., they pulled up to the school. Astrid had stayed late to rehearse a Christmas play with the students. She was standing on the auditorium stage when the detectives entered the premises. "Mrs. Dalton," Ramirez's voice echoed through the auditorium. "You're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Fletcher Dalton." She didn't even flinch. Calmly, she turned to the detectives, a slight smile playing on her lips. 15 years is a long time, detective, she said quietly. Long enough to learn to wait and to not make stupid mistakes. You do realize you can't prove anything, don't you? But her smile trembled as Ramirez pulled out a leather-bound journal. The interrogation room was drowned in the dim light of a single lamp. Astrid Dalton sat at her desk with her hands folded in front of her, a straight back, a calm gaze, no fidgety movements. The teacher's habit of keeping her face straight even now. Ramirez placed the journal in front of her. "Tell us everything, Mrs. Dalton." "You know," she ran her finger over the leather cover. "In literature, revenge is always portrayed as something passionate, rash. Othello strangles Desdemona in a fit of jealousy. Monte Cristo builds elaborate plots. But real revenge, it must be cold. Like a good brandy, it gets better with age." She talked for 4 hours, about how 15 years ago she'd accidentally seen her husband with his mistress, about how she'd followed them, collected evidence, taken photographs, about how his arrest gave her time to prepare. "For the first 5 years I just waited, writing letters, visiting him, playing the role of faithful wife. The next 5 I studied. Botany, chemistry, toxicology. It's amazing how much you can learn if you have time and patience." She talked about her home laboratory, her experiments with plants, and how she carefully chose her poison, the kind that is difficult to detect in a normal examination. "The last 5 years have been the most difficult. Everything had to be calculated, prepared, not to leave traces, and most importantly, not to let my emotions get the best of me." "Why did you have to wait so long?" Maverick asked. "We could have retaliated as soon as it came out." Astrid smiled. "That's the point. He had to believe that I had forgiven him, that our love had passed the test of time. Only then does revenge take on a real flavor." At dawn, she signed the confession. The detectives were leaving the station as the sun came up. "You know," Maverick said to his partner, "the creepy thing is, she never once said she was sorry." "Because she's not sorry," Ramirez replied. "It wasn't just revenge for her, it was a work of art." A month later, the court sentenced Astrid Dalton to life in prison. At the sentencing announcement, she appeared calm and collected. Only as she was being led out of the hall did she turn to the detectives. "I taught my students that great literature is always about love or revenge. Sometimes it's about both together. Now I know it's true." At the state women's prison, Astrid quickly became known as an excellent literature teacher. She led a reading circle for the inmates, where she was especially fond of discussing works of great love and great revenge. Her cell bookshelf is said to contain volumes of Shakespeare and a botany textbook.